So, all of us lived through the pandemic, and one of the really key things about the pandemic, sort of misnomers around the pandemic, is that it created all this change, okay? But the reality is, it was the biggest accelerator of change. There were already sort of trend lines. They may not have been as progressive as fast, but the pandemic sort of put them on hyperspeed, okay? And as such, many of us have felt kind of like these big pendulum swings in our lives, whether it was the way that we worked, the way our kids went to school, the ways we were shopping, et cetera, because we were in essence swinging from one side to another and back again in a very short period of time. And basically trend lines that take decades to occur, we all experience in essentially 18 months or 2 years, okay? And so this graphic really portrays some of the big swings. For instance, how many of you bought a shed in the last 2 years, 3 years? We got a couple. Well, only a few of you are part of the 400% that really drove the increase in shed sales in this country. In fact, my director of research works out of his shed now, okay? We've pivoted already how we use our sheds. And anyone buy a bike in the last 3 years? There we go, I'm in Maine, okay. Exactly, but now you're starting to see, if you bought a Peloton or a bike during that time, there's been some struggles in those industries. So we got some cycles that occur because of these big swings. And so I'm gonna talk a little bit about where we're at now, because many of those things that we were doing during the pandemic, some of them remain sticky, as we like to say, in the sort of trend analysis world, and then some of them have really pivoted or shifted. So, the big thing is, we have greatly expanded in terms of consumerism. The United States, we've always been a consumer-driven economy, and that's been on hyperspeed. A lot of that was sort of juiced by the amount of public dollars going into the system, whether they were in the form of governmental programs, or a lot of people got checks during the pandemic. So we're doing a lot of spending to keep the economy rolling during that period of time. And the beneficiaries of that were the retail environment, services, hospitality, entertainment, in different periods of time through that process. But we've greatly expanded that. And while some of that has pulled back, some of that spending, we haven't had you've probably seen, are we gonna have a hard landing in a recession? We've been calling it for a recession the last 2 years. And consumers are still going. And a lot of that has to do with the labor force. We still have low unemployment, and we've had a lot of wage increases as well. So far, the retail sales have kind of remained steady, but I'm going to talk a little bit about where probably that stands going forward. All right, a lot of people were very worried during the pandemic about bricks and mortar retail especially, and what was going to happen to the small business community. It was not a lot of fun during the 2020, where we were seeing so many of our businesses shut down or struggling to sort of meet the consumers where they were at, which was not inside the business, but might be outside or in sort of delivery services or what have you. And so e-commerce really accelerated. So in April and May of 2020, during that 8-week period of time, e-commerce grew at the same rate that it took the previous 10 years to achieve, in 8 weeks. That's how much market share was gained. And so a lot of that has come back, but certainly there is a new norm that's been created. Now, a lot of our bricks and mortar probably haven't seen some of that for a couple different reasons. One, they've been able to leverage it, and two, that new dollar, that spending figure is a lot higher. So it's not like that's gone back to 2019. The other big thing that's happening is because the e-commerce aspects really exploded, the whole e-commerce shopping experience has gotten pretty cluttered. It's quite competitive, and with social media's growth as well, which has been the main way of sort of attracting a consumer to the e-commerce landscaping, it's got a lot more expensive. And so in fact, bricks and mortar has actually benefited from sort of the struggles of the clutteredness, in essence, of customer acquisition in an e-commerce world. And so the pivot that you've begun to see out there is that many of the e-commerce only businesses, like Wayfair, for instance, in the furniture world, are starting to open up now bricks and mortar stores. So it's like sort of reversing the many businesses that started, like Warby Parker, others that started purely online, are realizing that we kind of have an experiential economy, and people need to touch, feel, sense the buying experience. The other big interesting thing that resulted out of the pandemic is, when people were seeing the e-commerce sort of escalation, was the fear that, oh no, Main Street's got another competitor. You can go from like JCPenney's and Sears Roebuck catalogs back in the 1950s to regional malls. I mean, we can keep going on. Big box retailing, category killers, the Walmarts of the world. Like, you can go through like decade after decade of competition. And so the sense was e-commerce is going to destroy bricks and mortar. I think what we found out was two things. One, bricks and mortar's got a long ways to go in terms of shifting their thinking, especially small businesses and our Main Street businesses. We did a survey in May of 2020, just to kind of get a litmus test on where small businesses were at the height of the pandemic. And the oh crap moment was when we found out that 2/3 of Main Street businesses did not have a digital face, in essence, did not have a digital component to their business. Now, not everyone is set up to do e-commerce, of course, but it wasn't even like they had a Google business profile. And so there was a long ways to go, and there still remains today. But the silver lining in all this, if we can get them there, it's actually not a bricks versus clicks scenario in a post-pandemic economy. It's actually a bricks and clicks. And you find that those that really have sort of cracked the code on that are doing wonderfully, because consumers are actually looking for both. And so that's a big sort of aha moment, I think, in the bricks and mortar space for our main streets, is the ability to actually leverage technology and leverage consumer trends to the benefit of what we're doing and expand the trade area. So if you're a rural small town and your small businesses, in the past, your trade area was pretty limited to either the local economy, or if you were fortunate enough to have a tourist economy, you could sort of layer the cake that way. But now you can be 24/7 anywhere in the world, and if you can build that brand experience, you've added a huge another layer to the cake, okay? One of the outfalls, though, and so my lens is always through Main Street, okay? So like the physical aspects of that and how sort of shifts in the economy or social or technology shifts are impacting then the built environment. One of those is actually in space demand, or I should say space supportable square footage of space. And what I mean by that is many more businesses have begun to shift to adding a e-commerce component, and as logistics in this country and across the world have accelerated to where you can have packages delivered, including your inventory, quite quickly, you don't need as much space for those kinds of things. You may not need to carry all the sizes that you were carrying before, or all the color schemes, because it can be delivered quickly. And so what you have happening in some places is more like web rooming or showrooming, where you're featuring the products, people can still try them on, and if you don't have that right size or that right color, it can be delivered the next day or simply in 2 days. And as such, what you're finding is retailers are looking at ways to begin to cut square footage. So that does impact Main Street. And so now what you find happening is the advent of like micro-retailing or shared space in many respects, which I think is a winning combination. I just had lunch with my friends at Main Street Skowhegan, and they've got their outdoor recreation base camp initiative in the Joe's Cafe. And what a great connection, so complementary to one another. And Joe didn't need all that space. The base camp, well, it's growing, maybe needs all that space at some point. But I think what we're emerging as a result of sort of the decline in need for a bunch of space as an independent retailer, a lot of opportunities to think about complementary retailing, or as I mentioned, micro retailing. So I'm not suggesting there is a lack of demand of individual businesses. It's the amount of square footage that each one of them needs. That's what's on the decline. Okay, so it's not the number of entrepreneurs or small businesses interested in opening, it's the amount of square footage that they're asking for. So maybe they needed 1,200 square feet before, and now they're going, you know what, I can get by with 800. So in a physical environment, we have to think about then, what's the impact on that? How do we sort of break up spaces? How do we create complementary opportunities? So that's really where the market is shifting to, it appears. Looking ahead, now this is always dangerous, okay? It's easier to look back and just sort of see what the trend lines are. It's another to start to do some forecasting. But I thought eMarketer did a really nice job. This is all the way back in 2022 and looking ahead at 2026. There hasn't been a lot of predictions outside of more near-term, third quarter, fourth quarter kinds of predictions. But they've pretty much hit the spot here. We've been pretty flat line when it comes to retail spending. One quarter will be slightly up, another quarter slightly down, growing between 2.5%, 3.5%. But the biggest things are we're shifting in how we spend money on consumer goods. And that's the big thing. We went from really one of buying things for the home and then moving into things like restaurants. We were breaking out of that, things that spoke to our lifestyle. We were all taking trips, and so some of the spending has really shifted. Okay? So I'll hit on that in just a little bit. Some of the other sort of consumer trends that are happening out there in our space is we formed a lot of habits. How many of you go to the same grocery store? Most of you, right? Or the same gas station. We are creatures of habit. We may not think of ourselves like that, but we do form habits, and we have consumer spending habits as well. Now, during the pandemic, most social scientists will give a pretty large range for how long it takes for us to form new habits. Well, the pandemic was around long enough that was a long enough span for us to form a whole host of new habits. And so many of those things remain sticky going forward, things like outdoor dining. We learned that we enjoy being outside and doing that. And so some of the spatial components about how we use place and how businesses think about their space needs really shifted during that time period, and that's remained pretty present. We also saw ways that they shifted their business models and maybe had less service. Now you order up at the counter, and maybe you have to go back up to the counter. So lots of different sort of shifts that occurred. But there's more on the horizon. It's not a static thing, and there are new emerging ways that consumers are leveraging or new trend lines coming in that are impacting the way that consumers sort of indulge and partake in our downtowns and our spaces. So one of the biggies right now is the try before you buy. This has been one of those things as an advent coming out of e-commerce where there was pushback, especially in certain sectors like the apparel sector. People weren't or shoes or something along those lines. People were skittish about going on and buying a pair of shoes and, oh my gosh, is that gonna fit? Or how am I gonna look in it if I'm buying a shirt or something along those lines? It still keeps getting pushed and people are really interested. The big holdup continues to be the return. It's a pain in the butt. And so what ends up happening is you order more than you anticipate because you're not sure, and then 9 times out of 10, you've got to return something. And so that becomes a pain, especially live in a small town, and you don't have somewhere to drop it off, or there's not a FedEx location. It's a pain. It's a convenience factor. And so while it remains a trend and more folks are trying it out, I still think it's problematic for the e-commerce world in certain sort of industry or retail categories. Buy now, pay later. How many of you heard of that? I think of it as like the modern day layaway. It's like, this isn't really new, folks. We had layaway, at least back when I was a kid, and then it seemed to go away, but this is like the whole thing of this, okay? If you're not familiar with buy now, pay later is essentially a new finance tool where, you can buy something, they break it out into 3 or 4 payments. If you make them on time, no problem. I think it's an interesting way to maybe get people to buy more than they anticipated because you don't have to have it all at that time. So I fight with myself internally just in terms of like, that seems pretty gimmicky and might get people in trouble. And I think about my own kids. They may not recognize this. But anyway, the key thing to remember here is things are scalable. And while it started with a lot of like the bigger companies, the Walmarts, the Targets, that kind of thing, using these kinds of tools, many small businesses now are using it and as another sort of incentive and another way that they can provide a service to their customers. The only other thing I'll mention here is while typically there's no interest if you pay on time, there can be large fees if you don't pay. And so there is a downside. They got to make money somehow. All right. As I was mentioned before, the other big thing, and you see this within that pendulum I showed in the first graphic, is we've seen some shifts in how people are spending money. Okay, they're still spending money, but on different things, as you can imagine. Starting out with a lot of things in the home, people were like buying gardening supplies and kitchen utensils and desks for their home office and sheds, as I mentioned before. But a lot of the spending has now moved to like personal services. We're giving ourselves gifts, we're taking trips, spending time in hotels or in airplanes. If you've been to the airport lately, it's still quite busy. And so there's been a lot of sort of shifting to that side of the equation. The other big thing is, trend line wise, is the kind of technology that we're using and what small businesses might want to think about. Was anyone here last night for the pitch contest? If you notice, there was a lot both in the terms of like the students and the sort of the adult competitors. When they were talking about social media, a lot of them would talk about like Facebook or Instagram, if you remember the conversations, right? The problem is we are getting very sort of distinct in our use of social media. Again, that's why the acquisition costs are so much if you're on e-commerce to obtain another consumer, because it's so fragmented. You have lots of different options. And so a lot of these choices are now based on like generational preferences, gender preferences, socioeconomic preferences. And so it's not like a one size fits all where I got Facebook and that's going to do the trick, even though we have still a lot of businesses that's their primary, what they primarily rely on. And so not only is that taking place at the same time where we've got to be far more sophisticated as small business owners in terms of how we're spending our social media to attract new customers. Things like SMS are really the big driver right now. How many of you opted in for getting a text from a business? Send you say like Christina's like, okay. Yeah, I know, maybe we don't want to admit it. I have some too, don't worry about it. The crazy thing is, and this will slide, of course, but the crazy thing is we're so used to text messages, and we're like Pavlov's dog, right? Like as soon as you get a text, I bet you within a second, like you all are looking at it. Am I right? Like you're like opening it, and so the open rates and the response time on text messages is insane. And while it's still a little pricey, when you think about the opportunity to access your customer groups, if you've got their phone numbers, they've opted into this or whatever, is pretty sizable. And so
This is beginning to emerge as a major marketing strategy, and like most things, it's scalable, price will come down, and you're gonna see more of your Main Street and your small businesses get activated in this space. All right, let's talk a little bit about how we build resiliency, because the pandemic, took a lot of our small businesses for a loop. As I gave you the data on how many of them were engaged in digital commerce or had a digital presence, that was pretty bad. And so that suggests that we weren't building a lot of resilient businesses out there. They were good for the time, but when something like really shook up, whether it's the economy or technology or societal shifts, they weren't necessarily prepared for that. So the underlying characteristics of small businesses is we've got to form more businesses that have that sort of agility muscle and are able to think about diversification of revenue streams. No longer can you be competitive by just expecting someone to walk through your front doors. Like, that's not gonna get it done. And so if you were here last night, a lot of the businesses were talking about like different revenue streams. Some of them had subscriptions. Some of them, were doing delivery. Some of them, had some e-commerce sales. Some of them had mobile components. Like a few years back, that probably didn't exist as much. And so Amex American Express does a trend survey. And what they found was really fascinating is that they're getting the message. Small businesses are getting the message. 3/4 expect not only to have pivoted this past year, but to continue. And I think that's just something we should build in to our entrepreneurial programming, how we think about training entrepreneurs, as well as how we think about growing and scaling our existing businesses, is having that agility diversification sort of thinking as part of their overall business model. So you're not just creating the business plan, putting it on a shelf. It's got to be revisited all the time because the pace of change, while maybe not like 2020, is still ever present. Okay. So here are some thoughts on likely transition points or shifts, other diversification revenue streams for small businesses. One is adding the subscription services. Subscription services were up, I think, 426% over the last 5 years. If you saw Panera, people are probably familiar with Panera. They did like the $7.99 coffee or whatever, and that was their subscription model. That was a loss leader. Like, they don't care, and you can come in and get as much coffee as you want, because they all know that you're gonna buy a scone and you're gonna buy a this and that ticket is actually $20, and who cares about the $7.99 a month? That wasn't the purpose. And so subscriptions are great because they're reoccurring revenues. It's the same way we all get suckered into like buying Spotify and HBO Max and whatever other streaming service, and that's why they discount the monthly. They want you on that just all the time. It's reoccurring revenue. So subscription is a great model if you're one of those businesses that has an opportunity to sort of deploy that. It also builds brand affinity and certainly really makes them sort of part of your community. I think creating small-scale business opportunities like production, small-scale production. So if you were selling coffee during the pandemic and you had a roaster, you had a lot of businesses start to think about, could I do third-party roasting? Could I private label that? Could I just bag coffee and sell it as a producer? Obviously, you've got a great example here in Main Grains. This not only has a B2B market, but also has now a B2C market as a result of the pandemic. And so there's some great transition points about thinking about what do we do that's unique in our business that could have a wider range application to it, whether that's in food, apparel, you're making jeans, or what have you, to jewelry, to artisans, crafters, makers, et cetera. They're great at expanding trade area, okay? You can pull in from lots of places. Another big pivot is rethinking about your sort of spatial model. So a lot of people are automatically thinking about, I need to open up a second or third location. Well, there's great opportunities to think about, maybe I buy a truck instead. I do mobile applications, or I go and I set up in a park for an event, or I go around to other farmers markets. There's just great sort of like interpoints that you can try as a small business, doing a pop-up or something along those lines to expand your reach, or better yet, test a new concept. So rather than like change your whole menu, like go out and do an event and try something else out, or if you've got a new product. So there's some great ways to not only extend your reach, but also to kind of like do some R&D without spending a lot of money. We call that the kind of like the fail fast movement. Try something early, do something at small scale while it's a lot cheaper, and then see if it works. The other big shift I see happening is more and more businesses outside of coffee houses and microbreweries creating third spaces in their building, in their business. So third spaces are basically the space that's not your home and it's not your place of work. And obviously with like remote work and having a yearning to be with other people, third spaces have greatly increased. But now you see them in lots of different kinds of places, okay? Beyond the traditional of the coffee, or even like the libraries or something along those lines, to where you can walk into a salon and it's like you got your own little community and people are talking in there and you're kind of hanging out. I've seen like living room creations in apparel stores. Like, let's try some things on. Let's like watch and have a conversation. And here, they're serving me wine. Why not? I should stay here, okay? So I think that whole living room concept will continue to expand. And it's another way, even though you're not selling as part of that, but it creates brand identity, brand affinity for the business. Shared spaces is another big shift with more micro-retailing. So you're seeing these advents of micro-retail with wraparound services. I see that as a huge new movement. And then using social commerce. So that's not just putting out a social media statement. That's actually using influencers that are talking about your product online, and then obviously that's generating sales as a result, okay? It builds trust and relationship and bond because it's a third party. Using social media is a way to do that. All right. Now so we'll talk a little bit about some technology shifts. Celeste is like laughing at me. I couldn't go a whole presentation without talking about AI, right? Come on, everyone, like pick up a newspaper. Well, you can't pick up a newspaper anymore. You read a newspaper online. Sorry, it's a little joke. But automation and AI is definitely coming, and it's already here, frankly. I took this shot. I was in Wytheville, Virginia, and this is a new coffee shop that had opened. And I was blown away that I could order and pay from like what I would expect to do if you were like, you've seen them in McDonald's, right? And now this little tiny coffee shop in Wytheville, Virginia, which is in rural Appalachia, had them as well. So things are coming down to scale as a way to, in some ways, deflect some of the workforce challenges a lot of small businesses have faced over the last few years. We're seeing AI be used to help out small businesses with like create a social media strategy, to write content, to be my personal business assistant, because I can't afford to hire a whole new assistant. So like these kinds of technologies, again, they come to scale very quickly, and these are tools that a lot of the big players are using that can help businesses be more efficient or to create more margin for their products or reach more customers. And while there are sort of dangers about maybe the separation of technology and separating us, which I'm totally get, there's sort of a balance point here with some of this technology. So that's kind of where we're at right now, where technology has divided in many respects. We call it the age of dispersion. But at the same time, we need to leverage it where possible. All right, I'm also anticipating and starting to see that the lines are blurring between retail and service. They used to be very distinct. If you need to go get your hair cut, you went there, and if you needed to buy like hair supplies, which I know nothing about, as you can tell, and you would go to another store. But now, most of the time, you can walk into a salon, I suspect, and you can buy like hair care products and all kinds of personal care products, as well as get your hair done. And so I had to like renew my TSA, and so I had to go to a Staples. It was the only place. I live outside of, about an hour and a half outside of Richmond, Virginia, and it was the only place I could go to get it quickly done. And so I went to a Staples, and holy smokes, I thought they just sold office supplies. They had like every service under the sun. I meant it looked like a post office in there. So you could do your TSA, you can do passports, you could get things printed professionally. And so these lines will continue, and McKinsey's done some work and sort of studying this, but many are just like layering on, like building a cake, okay? I sell products and retail products, I sell services, I sell data, or I figure out a way to monetize data. Like they keep layering on different revenue strategies. So this line will continue to blur. Obviously, go into a bike store, you can buy bikes, you can get your bike serviced, on and on and on. All right, let's talk about what communities and how communities might be able to sort of change or impact their small business community. Certainly one way is to support small scale production. I had to throw in Maine Grains there. I'm sorry, as I blew up the picture, it kind of got grainy. No pun intended. That sucked, I know. Okay, what's that?
I'll send you a high-res one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is what happens when you screen grab off Google. But I think communities moving into thinking about like ways to better support small scale production, think about illuminating those opportunities for your existing business are great ways to scale your small businesses. And again, provide a huge layer to the cake. Expands market reach, expands brand identity, builds identity for the community as well, and can support other sort of like line extensions from that, much like you see with Maine Grains, where there's a whole host of new spawning businesses as a result of having that small scale producer here in Skowhegan. If you can't tell, I'm a big fan of Maine Grains. Okay, the other big thing I see shifting that communities can help out is making a transition from what are really passive third spaces to more like, I don't know, I'm just calling this a micro community. As I mentioned, we live in an age of dispersion where technology has allowed us to, in essence, not talk to one another, not be around one another, not socialize with one another, at least in person. We do it online, we get educated online, we go to work online, you can get your public services online, like just about everything can be done online. And as a result, much like that pendulum, there's also, I think, a pendulum swinging about how we need to be reconnected. And small businesses have a role to play. This is an example of Brewability. They're a microbrewery in Inglewood, Colorado. If you want to see a great film, we did a great film on them. Go to YouTube, look them up, under May Street America. And what they've done is they've created a community for those in the disability community. And so, you know, a lot of people with a disability, whether it's a mobile disability, a learning disability, autism on spectrum, what have you, maybe don't feel comfortable in going out to eat, or don't have opportunities for employment. And what Brewability has done is really create an environment of not only where people feel comfortable, and there's tools, there's a special room that you can go into if you have autism, and like shocked by noise or light, to employment opportunities, and they create programming around. And so that's the other key. So I was in Biddeford yesterday, talked with the folks at Elements. Anyone bid in Elements? You know, there's another community that's formed there where people feel a close connection to one another, participate in book clubs and, you know, special readings. And so I think what we're starting to see, and what I hope is the next evolution, is that we go from passive engagement of third spaces yes, you can go to a coffee shop and you can work and you can be around other people, but you're not really engaged with them, okay? And you gotta be really proactive to really sort of purpose-driven active engagement. All right, a few others here, and then if we've got time for questions. The other big thing I think we're seeing out there is a convergence between community and economic development. That if economic development in the past has been about sort of land cost and utility rates and do I have access to water that I need or what have you, today the battle is about human capital and talent. And if that's the equation and where people can be decoupled from places of work, that means place is ever more important than it's ever been. That's why we saw so much dramatic moves around the country. And in fact, if you pulled data in the summer of 2020 from Atlas Van Lines, do you know what was the top place people were moving to at that time with Atlas Vans? Because obviously they only have their data. It was Maine. Maine was the tops. It was crazy. People probably thought Florida and Texas, and yes, that's occurred. But Maine, during that first peak summer of the pandemic, Maine was right up there. So place becomes ever more important when you're battling it out for human capital. And so the International Economic Development Council, for example, showcases that by creating new programming around things like entrepreneurial-led economic development. Because if you look at communities, about 80% of our communities, the economic base was created by people that lived here. They weren't recruited, they weren't incentivized to move there. So all these throw out 10,000 to come move there. That's tough for people to move for 10 grand. You gotta pay them a lot. That we create businesses based on our own human capital. And so the ROI on doing something like that, by making your community a great place where people want to be, want to stay, is tremendous. And so even if you look at Recompete, where we're talking about workforce development depends on social capital. It depends on having relationships, having a network, knowing what jobs are open, knowing how to access programs. That means you need community. That means you need engagement. So there's these blurring lines. What did Maine do with a lot of their ARPA money? They put it into childcare, right? At least that's what I heard on the radio when I've spent I don't know how many months in Maine over the last couple of years. I think that was a brilliant idea because the biggest impediment to workforce has been, which is on the community development side, has been the ability to go back to work if you have nowhere to place your kids. So lots of convergence and intersections between community and economic development, and I think that's a good thing. The other big shift is as places become ever more important, it means we need to think about how they can serve as a foundation for other forms of economic development. So this is sort of a microcosm of the last slide. So this is actually a graphic from the Center on Rural Innovation. Anyone know Corey? Yeah, okay. A few folks. What you'll notice is at the foundation of a high-tech, or what we call a high-propensity ecosystem. So if you want to build high-techs, every state wants a high-tech industry or something like that, whether it's in biosciences or life sciences or IT or what have you. But if you don't have the foundation, it's not going to happen. And the reason being is, unlike in the past, it's all dependent on human capital in place. So you'll see I circled here, you gotta have housing. Not only do you gotta have housing, but it's gotta be affordable. And you gotta have affordable housing. You gotta have culture and entertainment options. You gotta have attractive live-work downtowns. You need broadband infrastructure. Better build capacity into your local leadership and your nonprofit and civic organizations. And you need these spaces where we create accidental collisions. Well, most of that occurs in your downtowns. So if we're not investing in place, if we're not investing in main streets, you can't get there. It's not gonna happen. And so this convergence, this codependency is really important. So support our local businesses, support our downtowns, support our main streets, and lots of other things begin to happen. All right. We're also living in an era of what we call an experiential economy, and And we've got another separate economy called the transactional economy. And we all use both. And they all both have purpose. This is sort of that alignment between e-commerce and our small businesses along our main streets, okay? This is the exact same place. This is Walter's Flowers in El Dorado, Kansas. If you're going to go buy flowers and you're not sure what you want and you want to have an experience or whatever, you're probably going to go there. It's actually a very nice place to shop. It's got great music, great lights, great displays. They do fantastic. But you know what? They're also smart enough to realize some of us just want convenience. Or some of us want to send something somewhere else in the local community, but you live elsewhere. And so this is their online presence. Quite distinct, right? This is transactional. Don't really care about the experience. If I'm buying a water filter for my refrigerator, I don't need to go and have an experience about it, okay? And so it's critical as we think about place that experience matters in that, but you can still have a transactional part. That's the cake layering again. So big difference, understand those, and we'll be a whole bit better with our small businesses. All right. Another big thing I think is happening within our communities is a rethinking of our civic spaces, okay? Again, civic spaces were almost transactional. You went to the library, you checked out a book, sort of transactional. It wasn't like you thought about experience there. God, this shows up really bad, sorry. This is actually in Marion, Iowa. They had a derecho go through, if you're not familiar with the derecho, and it tore down their library. They built a new library. They put a makerspace in. I've seen libraries now with rock walls in them. This is in Norfolk, Virginia, that has one of the best recording studios in their library. Experience, a new way to think about leveraging civic spaces beyond sort of the transactional, that they're just sort of like there. And so I think that rethinking, whether it's our town halls, to our libraries, to our public spaces, like we're doing here, or they're doing here, I want to support it, and Skowhegan with the riverfront with trails. These all are part of our civic infrastructure, and they can be great in terms of small business support, economic and community development. So I mentioned before, business attraction depending upon human capital. I just want to give you a quick example of this. So I've done a lot of work with Georgia Power down in Georgia. Now, when you think about a power utility company, 9 times out of 10, their interest in economic development is big power users, right? So Georgia has done a fantastic job of attracting a lot of like EV vehicle stuff, battery producers. And so a story that they shared was when they were recruiting Hyundai to put a new battery plant in Georgia. Again, it didn't come down, their site selection did not come down to land cost. Some of it workforce availability, of course, there's the human capital side of it. But the story they began to share was they were talking about cultural assets, community diversity. Diversity can be in a wide range of different spectrums. It can be about simply having like different kinds of restaurants and being an open community, accessible. And so there's like key words that begin to get used, and they boiled it down to, they'll say things like, well, we need to attract like world-class talent to this community, or we want to create a positive work environment, or build a strong company culture. And so a lot of that boils down to the diversity of the community. So we'll see more of that happening, and that's a good thing. And then I think this is probably one of my last slides, but I always like to put in a prediction. So this is my prediction. During the pandemic, we had 31 to 33 million permanent moves. Okay, a lot of that gets picked up by IRS migration data. And so people moved all across. They moved to Maine, they moved to Florida, they moved to Austin, Texas, et cetera, et cetera. And some people were transferring from big city to rural areas and from different states to different, right? My sense is we're not done yet, but it's not from people going from one place to another place as an original move. It's transitioning back. Okay, and it may not be back, and it's Jake, right, from this morning? what was his name? Jake, right? He talked a little bit about this in terms of climate. Maybe it's like a 2 to 3 hour window, although it could be more. Is I think we're going to be shifting back to some places, not all, but I think these are the 3 primary drivers. So we're not done with migration patterns in the country. We still see some nuance there. One is going to be affordability. I mean, the monthly rent in Austin jumped 24% last year. And that key continues to escalate. At some point, like wage rates can't keep up with that kind of thing where you're feeling displaced, especially if you're from a local perspective. Climate. Parts of Florida are seeing 50% spikes in insurance rates, whether it's on auto or home, and many of insurance have just walked away. And I think that was something that Jake brought up this morning, so I'm glad my slide jived with what he was saying. And then politics. And I'm not gonna get into a blue or red deal, but people are making decisions about their lives based on politics now. And so I think these are the 3 key points, and places like Maine, again, on the climate side, I know there's been spikes in other areas like across the country, but still pretty affordable. And I don't know, I shouldn't go into the politics of Maine. I don't know nothing about it, but it seems pretty purple. Okay, all right, shameless plug, I have to do it. If you're interested in knowing more, not from me, but from those actual small business owners, you want to find out what's happening, where they're seeing trends, where their challenge points are, what advice they have for other small businesses, please subscribe. It really helps to build what I think is missing in this country, and is the untold and unheard stories of America's small business community. What we have left on that is typically the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post, New York Times, LA Times, what have you. And that's all about Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg, et cetera, et cetera. And it's not about Joe's Cafe or the Bankery or Maine Grains, although we got Maine Grains in the Wall Street Journal. But those are the important stories. And if we lose that, I think we lose an important part of what being here in America is all about. So please join us and share the stories, whether you listen to this or you just share them on a local basis. It's really important. They're the heart of our local economies. So please do it. And then I'll just wrap in saying that don't forget the quality of place matters. Even in an age of dispersion where there's been a big battle that place doesn't matter, it's actually quite the opposite. And hopefully this story, some of the data has demonstrated the importance of that. Livability matters, quality of place matters, and that will make all the difference going forward when you think about economic development in your communities. So thanks for having me, really appreciate it. Here's my contact.
Thank you, Matt.